Hello again, and welcome to Mastering Dungeons. I am, as always, Shawn Merwin, and we have a very, very special episode today, which I am going to let Teos Abadea tell us about.
Absolutely. We are joined today by none other than Tim Harford. And if you don't know who Tim is, he is a quite amazing chap because he's from, that's what you say, right, Tim?
Yeah. Well, that's what you say about me. That's fine.
Fantastic. Tim is both a friend of mine and, more importantly, he is a world-renowned economist, author, and podcaster. I think he began podcasting because he heard Mastering Dungeons. I may have that wrong. But we are super happy to have you here with us, Tim.
Oh, thanks so much, Teos, and thanks, Shawn. It's great to be on the podcast, and I'm excited to get started and see what we have to talk about.
Yeah, and well, you came to our attention more than usual because of the latest episode of Cautionary Tale. So we're going to talk about that episode. But for folks who don't super know you, tell us about what you've been doing as an economist, as an author, as a podcaster.
Sure. I mean, I'm basically a writer who writes about nerdy social science stuff. So economics is what I was trained in, but behavioral science, sociology, statistics, anything I can get my teeth into. And I write a column for the Financial Times. I present programs for the BBC, and I've got this podcast, Cautionary Tales, which is all about things going really badly wrong. And then they're true stories. I've got actors, we've got a sound designer, composer, Helena Bonham Carter is in them, and Jeffrey Wright and Alan Cumming. I mean, it's amazing to hear like proper actors recreating these stories from my scripts. But then I pop up in the middle and I go, well, actually, this is what a cognitive psychologist would say about what went terribly badly wrong in that situation. And the only other thing I do is I write books, lots and lots of books. The first book was The Undercover Economist. The most recent book was The Data Detective, which is all about trying to think clearly about numbers and how we sort of process and interpret and spin numbers.
And your books always have like 9 names, and then, well, I'd say 4. You have it's The Data Detective, 10 Rules for Thinking Differently About Numbers, but then is that the U.S. name of the book?
Yeah, that's the U.S. name. Yeah. So for tedious reasons, my American publishers and my British publishers couldn't agree on a name. So if you're listening outside North America, the book's called How to Make the World Add Up. But in America, Canada, and Guam, actually, it is called The Data Detective.
Guam always playing strong.
Yeah.
Right. So tell us a little bit about the book and what you tackle in it.
So the book is really what I've learned in 15 years of presenting a show for the BBC called More or Less, which I think is most obviously a fact-checking show. Politicians say stuff that's not true and we smack them down. But actually, the more I did that, the more I realized there's something more important going on here than just telling people, oh, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true. Actually, what is true is much more important than what's not true. And so I became very interested in the idea of using statistics, using data to discern what's true about the world. Science, social science, demography, economics, and of course, most recently, COVID. To understand what's happening when this pandemic hits us, you need the numbers, you need really good, solid numbers. And so the message of the book is, it's not just about misinformation. It's not just about politicians lying to you. It's also about trying to see the world clearly through numbers. And maybe to do that, you need to be a little bit wiser about your own biases as well. So that's what the book's about. It's been great fun working on it. And hopefully by the end of reading it, people will just be a little bit more curious and maybe a little bit more confident in using the numbers, because we do lack confidence. I think we're often told there's no way you can make your way through this kind of cesspool of spin without help. And actually, the sorts of questions you should be asking to make sense of things, they're not as complicated as you might think.
I think you just came up with the name for my next adventure, Cesspool of Sin.
Yeah, I thought I said Cesspool of Spin, but it probably was a Freudian slip. Yeah, let's go with Cesspool of Sin. I'd play that module.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we're into both spin and sin. on Mastering Dungeons, and that's fine. Where did the idea for the podcast, Cautionary Tales podcast, come from?
I think I'm fascinated by things going wrong because they make good stories. I wrote a book a few years ago called Adapt, which was about, the subtitle was Why Success Always Starts with Failure. And it's about people learning from mistakes. And I'm quite proud of the book, but I found the most interesting bits of the book, the bits that people were really engaged with, they were the mistakes. Like the learning from the mistakes, that's okay. But like just reading about other people's mistakes is fascinating. And there's as someone who's interested in storytelling, there's a real range because you can talk about real tragedy, but there's also a comedy in mistakes. And you can just have stupid things going wrong for stupid reasons, and that's fun too. And as long as there's some lesson, then it makes for a great story. So that I've been doing it since late 2019. But I have to say, the producers, Pushkin, they've done an amazing job in really raising the bar in my ambition. Because I thought, oh, that's fine. I'll write a story, and then I'll be in front of a microphone and I'll tell the story. But Pushkin were like, no, we're going to get some A-list actors. We're going to do the music. We're going to do everything, and it makes a huge difference.
It really does. It's amazing. It's wonderful listening to them. By the way, Adapt is one of my favorite of your books. It is true. There's something about hearing how he got things wrong that's so incredibly attractive, and I think that's a lot of what we do on this show with Mastering D&D is to look at the various ways that design can go wrong, and then what do you do at the table to kind of correct it, right?
Yeah, I mean it's just a great way to learn. I mean we were always told learn from your mistakes, which is fine, but often we're so invested in the decisions we've made. It's very, very difficult to even notice your own mistakes, let alone to fix them. Yeah. But to notice other people's mistakes, that's really instructive, and it's a lot less painful as well.
I think Shawn and I are good at seeing our own mistakes too.
Oh yes, just starting this podcast, probably our biggest, but we're doing fine.
Plus, fans always let you know about your mistakes. So.
Oh yeah, for sure. So the specific episode of the podcast that we want to start on is the most recent one that talks about the Satanic Panic,
demonizing Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. So as a player of role-playing games and Dungeons and Dragons, were you specifically looking for a way to bring gaming into the podcast?
Yeah. Well, I was initially really interested by something that was basically a totally different question that I think is a really interesting question, but not a good story, which is, did they have Dungeons and Dragons in ancient Rome? To which the answer seems to be, no, we don't think so. And then why not? Like, why do some, because it's not as an innovation. Like you need pencil and paper. You don't even really need a randomizer, but we've had kind of dice and similar randomizers for a long time. So why didn't somebody invent role-playing games 2,000 years ago? So that's what drew me in. I thought that's such an interesting question. But the more I looked at it and I read these histories of D&D, the more I thought it's a great question, but it's not a great story. And I was just drawn to the story that I think a lot of people will know a little bit about, but not many people know all the details, which is of a boy who went missing, and Dungeons and Dragons got the blame. And all the details and the twists of that story, just once I started encountering it, I went deep, because it's a sad story. It's also an amazing and fascinating one.
It is, because there's so many different actors, and it captures our imagination the way this kid goes missing, Dallas Egbert, in 1979, in these sewers under the university is where we imagine that he's gone off to. And what a better place to go missing when you're a Dungeons and Dragons player, right?
Yeah. So this was the thing, that the rumor on the campus was that he was a D&D player, and that, like lots of D&D players, he played in, well, you said sewers, Teos. They were actually the steam tunnels, but they were just, so when I hear the word steam tunnel, I think of like a big metal pipe, and there's steam inside it, and you're inside the pipe with the steam. And the way they're described in one first-hand account, William Dear's book, The Dungeon Master, it does make it sound like they're an absolute death trap. You could just have your face blasted off by a vent of steam at any moment, and an incredibly dangerous places. Actually, if you Google steam tunnels, you get directed to the Wikipedia entry for utility corridors. And Dallas got lost in the utility corridors. It's just not nearly as exciting a description. But yeah, it's basically just some passages around the campus that have hot pipes in them. And yeah, it did seem that people went down there and did some LARPing, some live action, but probably. But then the question is, well, did that have anything at all to do with Dallas going missing?
Right.
And I know I had heard this story. I think we'd all heard this story. Anybody who played games in the 1980s did so against the backdrop of this story. But there's very little discussion of what actually happened. We instead get the narrative from Mazes and Monsters, the Tom Hanks movie, which a lot of people think must be like, oh, that's kind of what happened to Dallas Egbert. It's nothing at all like what happened to Dallas Egbert. In Mazes and Monsters, Tom Hanks just loses his mind. And that was supposed to be what had happened to Dallas, but the real story is very different.
I like that the private investigator that the family hires decides to look into the fact that the kid played D&D, and he hires a dungeon master to run D&D for him, pays him a big sum for the time, and more than most DMs get paid today. And the conclusion that the private investigator, William Dear, has basically like, this is too much fun. Something must be wrong with this, right?
Yeah, it's incredible. If you read William Dear's book, The Dungeon Master, which I hesitate to recommend. It's actually a really fun book to read, but I think, I don't want to deliver too many spoilers, but William Dear is a problematic figure in this. His whole role is very problematic. And I think he's something of an unreliable narrator as well. But the book is really fun to read. But the most fun bit in the whole book is William Dear describing the adventure he has when he plays Dungeons and Dragons. And we just go in, it's like the play within a play. And he describes it incredibly vividly. It sounds like a really great game. He sounds like he understood the game really quickly. He totally got into it. And I was reading this and going, yeah, this is a great game. There's double crosses. They get taken prisoner. They bluff their way out. They're completely overpowered, but like a great bit of inspired role playing, and they get out of this terrible situation. And then the way he describes it, it's almost like he wakes up and he's been hypnotized. He's been in some sort of trance, and like it's got dark, and the dungeon master's left, and I think he barely noticed the guy leaving. And you think, wow, like I wish all my games were this good. but yeah, at that point, from he switches from there's this really weird thing, and maybe there's like these really strange dares going on in this very, very dangerous place. He flips to, oh, it's just some people with dice around a table, but it's so amazing. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe it's too good. He lost his mind because the game was too good. I mean, at this point, you're really clutching at straws. I think that's probably not the reason why Dallas Egbert went missing, but yeah, it is. He's clearly hooked. He clearly loves the game.
That's so funny. I mean, that he named his book The Dungeon Master, right? It says so much in so many levels.
Yeah. I mean, the end of the book, he's saying, it's such a shame that everybody got really into this Dungeons and Dragons hypothesis. It's like, well, okay, first of all, it was your idea, William. And second, when you published a book years after the event, you still called it The Dungeon Master. So,
that's really
okay.
funny.
So could you tell us a little bit about William Dear, sort of what his take or what his background was before he took this case, and how he sort of rode it to prominence?
Okay, so the first thing you have to understand about William Dear is that when he comes in the Cautionary Tales, the composer Pascal has composed this fantastic 1970s kind of funk detective track. Every time Dear's on stage, there's this kind of the synth is playing. It's just it just makes me smile every time. So yeah, William Deere, he's got a private plane, he's got these massive jewelry. He's a fast talking Texan. He's got a whole team of Vietnam vet, and he's got spy microphones, and he's got this amazing operation. At least he describes it as being this amazing operation, and we're left to figure out how amazing it really is. But he's this really larger than life character who, since writing The Dungeon Master, has written books about OJ. I think he wrote a book, OJ Simpson is Innocent and I Can Prove It. But I think he also wrote a book that said that OJ was guilty. I may have misremembered that. He presented a show called Alien Autopsy, Fact or Fiction, which I haven't seen. It's a Fox TV show. I'm guessing at the end he concludes, oh, it's actually fiction. Having basically bigged up the aliens throughout, that would be on brand for him. And he's still alive. He's still going strong. Apparently has a career as a detective, but he seems to be much more of like a TV personality. You know how these things are.
Yeah, he should open up Hoffa's vault or something like that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. I love, and I want to know, so who did the voiceover? There is, at one point when William Deere, you're covering how the investigator is looking into D&D and learning about it, and there's this, a woman, a female voice that says this, is my favorite quote from the show, which says, "I don't know how to play it, but I do know that you can't play if you're a dumbass."
Yeah.
Who did you get to do that voiceover?
I think that's Messiah Monroe, I think. So the weird thing about producing the podcast in lockdown conditions is that I don't think I've met any of the actors. I certainly haven't met most of them. And so I'm weirdly disconnected. So I write the scripts, and there's a process, there's an editorial process. We do reads, we do edits, we fix everything, and then I edit this, and I read the script in a studio, and my producer's just kind of miles away on Zoom, and then the recording gets sent to my producer, and then the actors are then brought in later, and I'm not there.
Yeah.
I mean, I wish I'd been there when Helena Bonham Carter was Florence Nightingale. I wish I'd been there when Jeffrey Wright was Martin Luther King. And Jeffrey Wright is incredible as Martin Luther King. Yeah, this is obviously Nightingale and Martin Luther King are not in the D&D episode.
I mean, but why not, right?
A different game, maybe.
Yeah, but the actors are terrific, and we're asking a lot of them because the Cautionary Tales, there are 14 in this series, and you just go all over the world. We're at all sorts of different actors, all sorts of different roles, and they're doing a lot. They're doing an amazing job.
It's fantastic. So I want to ask about, because the Satanic Panic is something we do indeed talk about all the time. It comes up all the time. Like I listen to the official D&D podcast, and one of the co-hosts often talks about how they were prohibited from playing. Guests will say it all the time that, I couldn't get started when I wanted to because of this. In fact, I was talking to my wife today, and she was mentioning that her brother, I didn't know this, her brother, she recalls hearing a conversation with her parents discussing her brother and how he shouldn't be allowed to play D&D because of the demonic influence. Mm-hmm. Right? It really permeated American culture, and I guess in the UK as well. Did you hear that often?
Yeah, it did. I mean, the evangelical Christianity is not as strong in the UK, but it does exist. And I was asked by a senior teacher at my school to explain what this game was, and he was worried that it was opening me to demonic influences. But to his credit, we sat down and I just explained how it worked for an hour, and he said, "Well, it sounds okay. It sounds fine." And so, he let us play. But I did have to have that conversation, which is interesting because I mean, if I'd been proposing setting up a badminton club or something,
right,
I don't think that would have been a topic of conversation. And of course, I mean, there have been panics about satanic influences in Harry Potter and in heavy metal, and so it's not just role playing, but I think there is something. So to me, role playing games are almost uniquely benevolent compared to. I mean, heavy metal I think is harmless, but I wouldn't think you would describe heavy metal as benign.
Right.
Like, but role-playing games is like, this is actually what we want our kids to be doing. It's creative. It's it requires literacy, and it requires numeracy, and it requires cooperation. It's everything that we keep saying we want our children to be.
Yeah.
And yet people lost their minds about this game.
Why
And I think it's just that it's so mysterious. People just didn't get it. They didn't understand what it was.
Having grown up exactly during the Satanic Panic of D&D, I cannot fathom the situation I'm in now, where coworkers of mine who are middle-aged folks who were probably looking at the kids who played D&D strangely back in the 80s and 90s, asking me, my child wants to play, how do I get started?
Yeah.
And that 180 that we've seen is amazing. And I get angry when people ask me about the Satanic Panic, or I used to, because I had to so much defend the game, and nothing you said would get through, because it is, as you say, so hard to explain what the game is without actually sitting down and playing it. And Mazes and Monsters is one of the things I think that triggered the Satanic Panic of D&D. I think it might have been, people may have heard about it, but when it's on CBS at 8 p.m., I remember watching it. I remember the channel it was on, because we only got one channel, and it was CBS. So I know exactly what channel it was on. And I got through watching it and went, my life is going to be hell for the next 20 years, because people are seeing this right now.
Yeah, but it's an interesting question, though. It maybe there is an argument that role-playing was really made by the panic over the disappearance of Dallas Egbert and then Mazes and Monsters. So it was also in E.T., same year that Mazes and Monsters came out, which is, I think, 1982. So this is 3 years after Dallas disappeared. And it was featured in E.T. as this game that the older kid, I can't remember the protagonist of E.T. now, but he's the younger brother and his older brother and his older brother's friends. They're all playing Dungeons and Dragons. And I think it was, it's horrible to think it, because for Dallas Egbert, this was just a horrible experience that he went through, and for his family. But the whole kind of panic over his disappearance and the fact Dungeons and Dragons was blamed arguably put D&D on the map. Certainly that's what TSR said, that they could barely keep up with demand after all this controversy over the game, because it just gave, I guess it's the cliche, there's no such thing as bad publicity.
Right.
But it did lead to these very awkward conversations.
Gygax writes in a number of Dungeon or Dragon magazine articles, he talks about how this is, they're taking, he sort of says, we're taking this seriously and trying to explain to everybody, but also, wow, our sales are through the roof, right? He says this at many points, that and the sales in the 80s were the highest ever, and it had a brand recognition and a permeation in the consciousness that was sort of amazing and sometimes hard to figure out, because you've got a cartoon that's on TV for Dungeons and Dragons, and then you also have this Satanic Panic going on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. At the same time, it is very odd. It's very odd.
What do you think?
I remember the conversation I had with my parents. I don't think they were at all worried that I was doing role playing, but I used to do Tunnels and Trolls, which was one of the very first D&D clones, as you may well know. Well, not quite a clone. It was a spin-off. It was like, now role playing's been invented, we're going to do it a bit differently. But one of the things about Tunnels and Trolls was it had loads and loads of solo adventures. So you could just play by yourself, which I think as a teenager, pre-internet, that was the fate of a lot of role players anyway. But my father realized that these very elegantly illustrated books, Liz Danforth did the art in a lot of that, brilliant artist. A lot of naked ladies, though. A lot of naked ladies in Tunnels and Trolls. And I think there were occasionally in the D&D books as well. They didn't have to be there, right? And I think these days we would say that's probably, for a number of reasons, that's not something we really want in our role-playing supplements. Right. My dad sort of caught sight of this, and there were various kind of things in these solo adventures where you'd end up, a character would have a should we say, an adult encounter. And my dad was not delighted that his 12-year-old son was reading this stuff, but
Right.
he was like, okay, fine, whatever. If this is what you're reading, this is what you're reading. It could be worse.
You in your podcast, you cover the idea of how D&D role-playing games, they provide a breakdown between reality and fantasy. And this is sort of what's being accused of being the problem. But then you compare it to movies and how we can get lost in that breakdown. Is it maybe that has, as a concept, is something that's now more welcome?
Well, I think it was partly just a question of double standards. So William Deere said that maybe Dallas Egbert's mind had slipped through the fragile barrier between reality and fantasy. You have to say, is it that fragile? I'm not sure it's that fragile, really, but okay. So he said maybe Dallas thinks he's a wizard. This is the accusation. Maybe Dallas thinks he's a wizard. Maybe he's lost his mind. But the point is that actually all of this sort of art. So you watch a movie. When you watch a Marvel movie, you really think that Thanos is trying to destroy half the universe, and you really think that Captain America is, and he can pick up the hammer just like Thor, because he's pure of heart like Thor is. Like, you don't think to yourself, that's just Chris Evans, he's just an actor, and that hammer, it's probably made of polystyrene and anybody could pick it up, and it's just been put there by a stage. You don't think any of these things. Of course you don't think these things. So has the barrier between reality and fantasy broken down? Like, I don't watch horror movies because they scare me. Some movies make me cry. You could objectively say, Tim's weird, he's crying, and it's actually just actors, it's all pretend. He doesn't understand. Cinema paradiso, it's not real. It's just a made-up story. But of course we all understand that there's that suspension of disbelief. So to me, to say that, you could argue, okay, so you have to get into character rather than appreciate other characters in a role-playing game. But I think it's just double standards. I think it's just unfair. We're saying it's weird when you're creating a fantasy, but when you're suspending your disbelief to enter into somebody else's fantasy, that's regarded as being totally fine.
I wonder, I tend to think that it's something has changed because of how many devices we have in our world, that it feels like a lot of what we do when we're interacting with devices, whether it's YouTube or a video game or whatever, it's sort of this, it's a very kind of viewership type activity, even if we're in a video game a lot of times. And that maybe now there's this sudden realization of, oh, wow, how can we get kids to be, and people to be interacting in a way that more like we used to? Because certainly for me, when I run D&D for my son and his friends, all their parents are beyond happy. They're ecstatic that their kids are involved in Dungeons and Dragons, because I think they understand the way what I hear from them is they understand that this is a different way of behaving with one another than they normally are engaged in. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I discussed this a bit in the Cautionary Tales podcast. I talk about this, this famous piece of work by Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death, where Postman basically talks about how different forms of media are consumed in different ways and demand different sorts of argument or different. There's just, I mean, this is all pre-Twitter, but there's a certain kind of thing you can do on Twitter. There's a certain kind of thing that Twitter demands, and there's certain things you just can't do on Twitter. Similarly, there are certain sorts of things you can do on TV, even TV that pretends to be serious. It's often fundamentally unserious. And he says the medium is the metaphor. He's sort of channeling his teacher, Marshall McLuhan. And reading that, I thought, well, okay, so what's the metaphor of the role-playing medium? What does it demand? What does it require to be a good role-playing game? And it demands collaboration. Sure, you can play solo, but most role-playing is about collaboration. It demands creativity. At the very least, it demands imagination. But routinely, it demands creativity as well. That you produce your own scenarios, you create your own character. It's not just pre-generated stuff. And this is just absolutely, it's hardwired into the game. I think we often take it for granted. You wouldn't, I mean, to go back to Marvel, you wouldn't generally watch a Marvel movie and walk out of the cinema and go, that was great. I'm going to write my own script for a Marvel movie now. And I'm going to make up my own superheroes. And it would just, I mean, some people would do that, but it wouldn't be the standard response. But for role-playing, it's absolutely standard. I'm going to hack my own rules. I'm going to create my own adventure. I'm just going to make all this stuff up. Absolutely fundamental. And it's so fundamental, I think it's easy for us to lose sight of it. But it's really, I mean, it's a miracle, really, that this is what the hobby demands of us and that we so willingly produce it. And all gamers so willingly produce it.
Are we to the point where our media has sort of sanctified user-created content to the point where it's second nature, as opposed to maybe back in the 70s and 80s when we trusted everything to be made by the creative minds and anyone else was just an amateur? And so it was weird to act if you were not an actor.
Yeah.
It was weird to write if you weren't a writer.
Yeah. I don't know. I suppose, so we've had different relationships with different art forms over the centuries. So before you had recorded music, it'd be much more common for people to play a musical instrument, because if you wanted music, that's how you get music. You make your own music. So I guess there's a trend towards mass media in general, there's this push away from user-created stuff. Why would I play the piano when I could just play a CD of Oscar Peterson, or I could stream Keith Jarrett? Why would I play my own piano? And so that you get that pushback against user-created content. And then there was a fad for user-created content maybe 15 years ago. I was like, everything's going to be, our newspapers are all going to be kind of, it's all in the comment section. That's where all the joy is. And basically people looked at Wikipedia and then basically assumed that everything would be like Wikipedia. It'd all be great because user-created content is great. And very little user-created content is great. There are some exceptions, but a lot of it isn't. But for role-playing, it's absolutely standard. And it's not like we're saying, TSR should just get, any gamer should just kind of send their scenario ideas and it's not TSR, Wizards of the Coast these days, of course, but Wizards will just kind of publish everything. I mean, we're not saying that. We're just saying that obviously, as a matter of course, in a way that doesn't even need to be discussed because it's so obvious, of course you'll create your own adventures. And it doesn't need to be for anybody else. Like, it's fine if it's just for you and your group. There's no external validity, validation needed. Like, it doesn't even need to be written down. It still counts, and it's still a joyful and creative experience.
My great terror is that someday that might change, because it hasn't, right? Like, that has been true since the very beginning, that it is this idea of this scenario and the creativity of the DM and the players interacting with that, and everything goes in unpredictable directions because we're all creating it together. And I love that. And my biggest fear is that somehow something will come along to change that. Yeah,
I think it won't. So here's my theory. I hope I'm right. I think it won't because there's something fundamentally chaotic about a good role-playing game. If you get a good pre-generated adventure and good pre-generated characters, and you play it, and it just comes out exactly as the pre-generated adventure suggests it would, probably something went wrong with that game. Like, that's something weird. That's not how it's supposed to be, right? Any more than, like, if you show up for dinner with some friends and the host has basically got, like that Monty Python sketch, got all the conversations on 3x5-inch cards, and it's like, here are the conversations we're going to have, and we can't have any other conversations. Like, that's not going to catch on, right? That's not fun. Yeah. And I think that's why that's why people will keep creating, they will keep hacking systems about, they'll keep creating their own characters, they'll keep inventing their own stuff, because even if you're playing with everything pre-generated, and even if the pre-generated stuff is the highest possible quality, it's going to go off the rails pretty quickly. It has to. Otherwise, it's not role-playing. That's what I think. Anyway, am I wrong? Tell me I'm wrong.
No, I recall.
I don't think you're wrong. The only fear I have is how the audience, when you introduce an audience to a game, and especially when you allow audience interaction, does that mass of people watching, and do their desires, whether it's through a chat that's going on at the same time or any other feedback that they might have with the game, sort of push the game in a direction that maybe the players don't even want, but they know that audience is watching?
That's a really interesting question, and I don't have a good answer. I don't actually watch any of this, this live play stuff on YouTube. I still can't quite believe it is a thing, but I mean, I'm sure if I watched it, I would go, oh, yeah, I see why people like this. This is really great fun. But for me, I don't fully understand. I'm revealing my age here. Like I'm a Gen Xer. Like I was a teenager in the 1980s. It seems, if people want to do it, that's great. I don't fully understand it. But I guess the question, Shawn, is how popular is that as a way of engaging with the game versus just playing your own game? I know these YouTube channels and Twitch channels are pretty popular, but I mean, are we now like 80% of the people who play D&D aren't actually playing D&D, they're just watching? Surely it can't be like that.
Well, and I think that's where we get into this data side of things, in that I'm not sure we know. And one thing that we see a lot on the RPG side is that there are vocal minorities that are on places like Twitter.
Yeah.
Really small but loud groups that will say, this is what the game is, right?
Yeah.
But then...
That's what Twitter's for.
That's what Twitter's for. When you go to, an average gaming store somewhere in the middle of the U.S., or I've gone to ones in Europe as well, it's not really particularly different. And when you sit down with folks that are at this store, they don't follow anything online. Right, that's 90% of the time. I'd say if I speak to someone and I say, "Hey, did you hear about the new blah 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 product? Is it on this shelf?" No, they're talking about it. Oh, yeah, I don't know. I don't go online for that. It's a real disconnect, right? And so similarly, I wonder to what extent we really are seeing what percentage of people are vicariously enjoying D&D versus playing it versus reading it versus anything else.
Right. When I started this class at the local college, I took 20 students for, writing for role-playing games. That's the name of the class. And I was curious what it was going to be like, what their experiences were. And it's almost 50-50 of students who have played before and students who are interested because they have watched but never played. And obviously, this is a younger generation of 20 some and younger. So it's a new dynamic that we, growing up as just kids playing games, never ever thought would happen in a million years. And here we are, watching the paradigm shift.
Although I suppose, one thing I used to do, apart from, as we've already discussed, I used to play a lot of solo games, which you could reasonably say, look, going through Death Trap Equalizer or a classic Tunnels and Trolls solo scenario, it's not really the same thing as playing with your friends. There's not the same role assumption. It's much more of a mechanical thing. But the other thing I used to do, and I think I really don't think I'm alone here, please tell me I'm not alone here, is I just used to buy the books and read the books and imagine what it would be like playing a game, and then you never play that game. Never play that scenario, never play that. I used to play a lot of GURPS, never play that GURPS supplement. Just read and enjoy the books and kind of think about it. And I suppose maybe that's somewhat parallel to the vicarious experience of watching other people play on YouTube. You're contemplating the game in a more passive way, but it's not completely passive.
So I have to say, I would actually take normal Dungeons and Dragons modules and I would solo run through them. Right. Whenever I couldn't get a group together, I would have, I don't know how many characters. I would do fewer characters, but higher level. and I would run through the classic adventures just to know them, right? Because it was that next level. I'd read them, but what if I played them? And so I'd often get a new one before I read it, and I would cover up with a piece of paper and go through it as if it was made for solo play. And I would try to be as, fair as possible as a kid.
Yeah.
Somehow I ended up with a lot of treasure and few deaths.
Yeah, I used to find that with the TNT solo scenarios as well.
Yeah.
The old 5-finger bookmark technique.
Yep.
That happens.
It was like a choose your own adventure, right? It's very fun. But it's fascinating. The role-playing game industry is forever fascinating me because of how hard it is, I think, to understand what the audience is doing on a grand scale.
Yeah, and you've got this. You have very particular slices through of basically personal experience through the hobby. So for me, I don't play much D&D. As I say, I tend to play GURPS, but mostly with my group, we tend to play games that we've made up ourselves. There are several game designers in the group, and they'll just completely make up their own rules, everything, the setting, the whole thing. And that's just kind of what you would do. It just seems totally normal to us. And I tend to listen to podcasts from people who are of that school. So they tend to be playing indie games, new wave games, or just talking about making up their own games. But I know that there's, of course, this huge, really vital and really important part of the hobby, which is just centered around Dungeons and Dragons, which is this huge amount of resources. It's still the biggest brand name and just a great way to get people into the hobby. But I realized that as a committed role player, I've got very little idea what D&D is these days. Like, I'm assuming it must be similar to like the days of the red box, with the Larry Elmore art on the front. It's probably just the same, I'm guessing. Do you guys still chalk your dice? Yeah.
No, I haven't done that in a while. Although
you should see what people do for dice. They pay. I mean, the Kickstarters for dice these days are millions of dollars. It's sort of absurd. In fact, this is a whole aspect that I wish an economist would come and solve for me in my brain, because I don't understand the economy of our industry. Like adventures are still very close to the same price they used to be back when we got them at like KB Toys or any of these old shops that used to be around in the 80s. But dice can now be $50, $100 for a set in some kind of premium, beautiful configuration. And a dragon miniature might sell for $400.
Yeah, well, I suppose the challenge of monetizing the hobby is always a tricky one, right?
Yeah.
Because your fundamental problem, and this goes, I mean, Gygax and TSR were struggling with this from the mid-1970s. You tell people how to play the game, and then they buy one rule set off you. And that's it. And then very quickly, they don't even need to buy that, right? Because because Ken St. Andre invented Tunnels and Trolls. And he's like, oh, I see how you do it. I can just make this stuff up. And so the revenue stream, like what is the product that you actually sell to these people? Once the genie is out of the bottle, of like, there's this wonderful way to play a game. It's a new kind of game. Gygax and Arneson and David Wesley invented, and I talk a little bit about that moment of invention in the Cautionary Tales podcast. Who needs to buy anything? Like, you got Tim Harford and his friends, and they're just making their own games for free. Like, it's understandable, I guess, that a lot of the attention then shifts to supplements and gear. Like, how do we sell the gear? I mean, this is a basic idea all the way back in my first book, The Undercover Economist, is, okay, if your basic product is priced to reach everybody, how do you find some way of targeting the people with more money than sense? Like, okay, people only want to pay $1 for a coffee. How do I find the people who will pay $6 for a coffee and charge them $6? Like, what's the trick? And there are various ways you do this. And I guess the same thing with gaming. Like, it's a fundamentally incredibly inexpensive way to have a tremendous amount of fun for a very, very long time. Okay, but there's somebody out there who'll give me $20 for premium dice. So let's reach them. But the Kickstarter thing is fascinating too. I mean, that's a whole new world. So Teos, you're getting into Kickstarter now, or maybe you're an old hand.
No, well, I'm going to be launching one soon, but we see there again, there are people and entities who understand Kickstarter. And then there are those who are just using it. And these mortal people, of which I'm unfortunately a member of, it's exceedingly difficult to figure out how to cross that barrier into success. And you'll see this. You'll see a Kickstarter for a supplement. And you go, oh, yeah, this is cool. Everybody will want this. And it does okay. And then you see the next one. You're like, well, that's like that other one, but not as good. Oh, it's selling millions of copies.
Yeah.
It's raising hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars. How is, what has happened? And that's the thing, is that there, it's...
Yeah,
it's so
and somebody's
challenging.
pushing it somewhere. Somebody got on some podcast or somebody. Yeah, but it's hard to know behind the scenes what's going on. Please don't read chapter 5 of The Data Detective, because it will it will demoralize you.
I haven't gotten to that one yet safely.
Well, I talk about Kickstarter, and I talk about the thing about Kickstarter is, like, every product you've ever heard of on Kickstarter has just gone crazy. And that's why you've heard of them. You heard of them because they went crazy, like the watch, and then the cooler and all of this stuff.
Right.
But I talk about this website called Kickended, which is kind of an art project. It's created by a guy called Silvio LaRusso. And Kickended is you just click, and every time you click, it just pulls another campaign from Kickstarter that raised zero. Like, these are people who couldn't persuade their own family to kick in a single cent, and there are loads of them out there, but we never see them. You don't see them, because if anybody had ever seen them, they would have raised more than $0. So I'm hoping, Teos, that you're not going to end up
Me too.
in Kickended. I have confidence in you.
I promise, Teos, I will back your Kickstarter.
I will. I think I'm going to have 2 sales. I'm feeling good about that part.
That's good.
Tim and Shawn.
He doesn't need our pity. He can do it without
No,
us.
I probably do need that, but it's a fascinating thing, and Shawn and I talk about this a lot on the show. We talk about how much authors are paid, because there is that kind of crazy thing where you'll see a Kickstarter where, like, someone pays absurd amounts for dice, but almost nothing is paid to an author to write an adventure, right? And just, there's so many things in this industry that don't at first make sense when you just look at them at the surface level, or even dig in some layers down.
Yeah, I guess it's part of the problem is that all creative types are systematically underrated and undervalued, except at the very pinnacle of the pyramid. But the other thing is just that people will do this for free because it's fun.
It's true.
And if you've got a vast pool of talented people, imaginative people who want to do it for nothing, well, they don't want to do it for nothing, but they're happy to do it for nothing. They'll just do it. They'll put it out there. I just downloaded just this afternoon for a possible one-off, downloaded Lady Blackbird.
Mm-hmm.
So Lady Blackbird, I just heard that it's this great game for a one-off, and no spoilers, please, because I haven't looked through it yet. But it's free. It's just a PDF
great.
online. Boom. How does that work? And I'm told it's a masterpiece. So it's a free masterpiece. It feels somehow unfair, but at the same time, it's a wonderful thing.
And I think the reason you find some games like Lady Blackbird as free is because the creators are usually experienced enough to know that they can't really offer this as a product and really, cover it to the point where it's on a shelf in a gaming store, right? Like it's too hard to get there. And so it's better off as a promotional vehicle towards the work they do.
Yeah. Oh, that's it. You're doing it for the exposure. That's what they always say.
I guess, because I see a lot of good creators who will create an RPG and even put some good polish into it, into making, like, Lady Blackbird looks nice, but yeah, you can get it for free. I
suppose we should look on the positive side. Isn't it terrific that we have these resources as gamers that are available to us as labors of love? I mean, it's unfair for people who deserve to be paid for this stuff, but it is a blessing for the rest of us.
And more than ever, right? I mean, Dallas Egbert didn't just have to create, figure out how to play D&D, but also didn't have the resources that we have today for so many things, like mental health or any number of situations, right? Like it really is a different world.
Yeah, well, he was isolated in many ways, and mental health is still clearly a huge problem for a lot of students. But I did feel, as I slowly got to know, I got a sense of what he'd gone through and what he was struggling with, a lot of that would have been a lot easier today. His sexuality, for example, was a big issue for him. And I think it would have been less of an issue today. It's still perhaps a problem, but not nearly as much of an obstacle, not nearly as isolating as it was for him in the late 70s.
Yeah. So what do you have any plans for future topics on the podcast or in books that will touch on gaming?
There is another gaming episode later in the series. It talks about a game. Well, I mean, I'm seeing you on the video, Teos, dancing for joy, but you may not be dancing for joy when I tell you what the game is. It's called Monopoly. You may have heard of it. But it's about, it's a mystery story. Who really invented Monopoly, and who gets credit for this sort of thing? And there's a wonderful book called The Monopolists by Mary Plon about this, which is particularly about a more recent court case about who owns Monopoly, but she goes way back to the history of this game. But I also look at some of the economic research by an economist called Lisa Cook, who studied what she calls the pink and black gap in innovation. So women and minorities have, fewer patents, fewer jobs in innovation. Why? Where does the problem lie? Is it in the education system? Is it in employment? Is it in the patent system itself? And so just through the medium of this incredible person who really invented Monopoly, who will be played by Helena Bonham Carter, by the way, a woman called Lizzie McGee. I'm looking forward to hearing that performance. It's going to be fantastic. Her story and how she created this game and what this game was really about becomes a way to get into this, what might otherwise be quite a dry topic of who gets credit in our society for coming up with new ideas and who gets shoved to one side.
That's great. I look forward to that. My kids, despite having access to a plethora of amazing board games, somehow when a friend comes over, they pick Monopoly.
I would have thought you would have taught them better, Teos, but
I have tried. I have tried in so many ways, and it continues to happen.
Two theories about Monopoly. Why people still play it. The obvious thing is just the sunk costs. Like, you want to play it, you don't want to have to explain a game. So people go for Monopoly because they don't have to explain it. But the other thing is, one thing I think Monopoly has got that a lot of games don't have is it does have these moments of jeopardy where you're rolling the dice and you know that certain numbers are going to be amazing for you and certain numbers are going to be a disaster for you. And it's that excitement, like spinning the roulette wheel, looking at the cards in poker, the showdown. It's got that sort of moment of adrenaline, which I think a good board game should have, but not all of them do. So I think that's why people are still playing, despite the fact that it is clearly a profoundly flawed game.
Right.
I used to think that it was just because you got to handle money, but now $500 can barely get you anything. So I think that's sort of lost a little luster.
No, it could be. I mean, the funny thing about one of the other things about Monopoly, as I describe in the Cautionary Tale, is so Lizzie McGee is this amazing woman, but the version of Monopoly she created needed to be shaped and improved. And the guy who finally got the credit for that didn't do anything except commission a good graphic designer. But there were other people in between who did a lot to make it a more interesting game. And that process of sort of community improvement is important. But ironically, I think since Monopoly was published, the community has been steadily making it worse. So these rules. We're kind of going off topic here, but like the free parking rule, for example, the free parking rule just puts more and more, which is not in the original rules. It's the various ways of gets more cash into the game, and if there's more cash in the game, there's less strategy and more randomness, because a cash squeeze is an important part of the decision making, and B, the game just lasts longer. So the basic problem with Monopoly, which is it never ends, gets worse. The other thing is the original rules. When a property comes up, you have to either buy it or it goes for auction. Those are the original rules, but a lot of people play it so you can just turn it down, and so it's just again the original rules force more action, and the way that people tend to play the house rules just slow the game down and make it even more interminable.
The solution is, of course, to bring a role-playing component and overlay that onto Monopoly.
Right.
So that the shoe and the thimble can interact as you go on your buying spree adventure as monopolists.
I'm trying to imagine role-playing a shoe who is rich enough to buy Boardwalk. But
So have you guys ever played Talisman?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Talisman is the Monopoly of fantasy
That's
board
true.
games.
And it's similarly interminable, but yeah, that's the game you're looking for, Teos.
That's it. I'll just play more Talisman.
Just
Goodness.
turn Talisman into a drinking game, and you won't even notice how bad it is
Yeah.
after about the first 15 minutes.
That is a solution to many bad games.
That's true. So as an economist, do you, when you play a game, especially a role-playing game, do you focus more on the rules? Do you focus more on the role-playing? Is the role-playing a way to stop thinking about rules and mechanics for a bit? Or is it all a big jumble when you play?
So for me, the rules are like they're like the 10 bulls of Zen. They should disappear. When you're at the highest level, the rules disappear. And the last game I ran, which was inspired by Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea stories, although it wasn't set in Earthsea, it was set in somewhere that was a bit like Earthsea, because why would you take somebody else's idea wholesale when you could customize it? This is what I'm talking about. Right. But the rules I created for that were basically a very highly stripped down adaptation of GURPS. So GURPS has, as people may know, 2 chunky hardbacks. It's famously very, very detailed rule system, hundreds of skills. And I just boiled it down to, I'm going to change the attributes. I'm going to change the skills. So I'm only going to have about 10 skills. And the whole thing can be written on, 2 sides of paper. But we're going to keep the roll 3 dice and aim low mechanic, because I like that. And that worked really well. It worked really, really well. And yeah, I'm hoping that the rules tend to disappear. I have to say, I don't pay too much attention to economics in games. That feels like too much like talking shop. I mean, it's interesting. There's a guy called Edward Castronova who wrote a really interesting book about economies in virtual worlds. So he was interested in things like World of Warcraft. And he's got this idea that you could study economics by manipulating different World of Warcraft servers, for example, and seeing what happens if one's got more magic items. Do you have a sort of inflation problem, or how does it work? But he's really, really, really interested in how these economies work. But for me, I tend to kind of wave that stuff away. I mean, it could be interesting. There's probably is a really, really engaging backstory if you want to think about the economics. But I tend to think too much in terms of cool scenes and cool locations and cool bad guys.
Well, I recall the first time I played a game with famous Wizards of the Coast designers. And I was expecting this sort of they're going to break everything down and give me this deep analysis and peel back the layers, and I'm going to really see how their brains work. And it was a bunch of fart jokes. It was nothing at all. They were not turning on their design brains at all as we played this role-playing game. It was just, just being silly, being kids.
Did you find that incredibly disappointing or incredibly reassuring?
It was actually both, but primarily disappointing, because I thought I was going to really get to see how their brains worked. I mean, I guess I did, but But I was expecting this sort of breakdown. But then at times I have played with designers where they'll quickly just turn on that brain, do a mathematical analysis of a thing, judge it broken, and just continue on, right? They'll be like, oh, that's only a blah, blah, blah probability in this thing. So, no, it doesn't work, but that's okay.
I mean, my preference is that the game is ultimately about immersing yourself in this imagined world. You're an imagined person in an imagined world, interacting with other imagined people. And the rules are there to facilitate that. And you want the rules not to pull you out of that. That's my preference. I understand there are other ways to play and that they're all valid. But one of my problems with the kind of new wave of narrative games is they tend to have lots of rules about how all the narrative beats and kind of how you... And actually, if the narrative beats are in the rules, well, you're not really imagining the narrative. Suddenly you're role playing the writer's room of like a TV miniseries. Right. Like, how do we shape this story rather than being in the story and then only afterwards do you get to look back and say, well, this is what the story was. So my preference is not for that sort of game. I like the rules to be as simple as possible. But yeah, I mean, one of the great things is there's so many different ways to play this game and so many different ways to have fun. And I would not be telling somebody else like that's the wrong way to do it. If it's working for you, even the fart jokes, go for it.
Yeah, but it's true. Sometimes the narrative games do work so hard at enabling the narrative that they pull you out of it. And there are a couple of games where I struggle with the rules because of that effect they have.
Yeah.
Well, Tim, it has been wonderful to speak with you. Can you tell us where we can find you to learn more about your books and your podcasts and everything you're up to?
Sure. Well, Teos, there's this place called the Internet. You may have heard of it.
What is it? No.
It's kind of...
Is it in the sewers?
It's complicated. Yeah, it's somewhere in the sewers. It's a very dangerous place. People often lose touch with reality there. So the most important thing you need to know is how to spell my name, which is Tim Harford, Harford. It's not Hartford, Connecticut. It's Harford. And so timharford.com. I'm Tim Harford on Twitter. And the Cautionary Tales podcast is everywhere you could imagine getting your podcasts. If you want the show notes, they're on timharford.com. So that's where to find me.
Fantastic. No T in Harford. Very important.
So important. I always used to wonder why my father spelled his name out so often. And when people just started misspelling it at me, I realized, I mean, Teos, you don't have this problem because I'm sure nobody ever misspells your name.
Well, the thing is they don't forget it. And that's annoying because I meet somebody who has a name like Tim and 3 seconds later I've forgotten their name, but they remember a Teos because it's so weird. Yeah. And that's the thing I deal with is lots of people that expect me to remember their name like they remember mine. Yeah,
and Shawn is a name designed to be misspelled. So I think we're all bonding over this.
Yes. I try not to give people my name unless I have to.
I've got an idea for a role-playing game all around getting first names or last names that are hard to deal with. All right.
That creative spark. You see, it's irrepressible. We're already working with it. It's fantastic.
All right, Shawn, you want to take us out?
I will take us out. Well, first of all, Teos, where can people find you on this strange internet that I've heard so much about?
If it really exists, which is debatable, I can be found at a thing called Twitter, which I think is connected to Sigil. And I am at AlphaStream on Twitter. And my website is alphastream.org.
And you can find me on Twitter at Shawn Merwin, or you can follow the podcast on Twitter at MasteringDND. And speaking of Kickstarters, there's a new Kickstarter out that I am involved in. If you go to Ghostfire Gaming on Kickstarter, you can see that the Monster Grimoire is now live. And check it out if you need some horrific monsters. Mastering Dungeons is a misdirected mark production, the media arm of Encoded Designs. So Teos, and Tim, thanks again for coming. And Teos, what should we do now?
Let's go think about cautionary tales that we can tell all our friends.
I was going to say let's kill mazes and monsters, but
with fire, yes, please.
You can do both. Any good role player should be able to multitask.